Romany and Raq by G Bramwell Evens. Give me the clear blue sky over my head and the green turf beneath my feet, a winding road before me. And then to thinking. Chapter 2. Market Day, April. How varied is nature's wardrobe. Last week it wore an ermine cloak. Raq and I now found a smiling landscape before us, with the catkins quivering in the sunlight and the bluebells pushing their green spikes upwards. In nearly every field we saw the dark head of a partridge raised. A couple of mated birds whirred their way into a neighbouring field, from which, within a moment or two, we heard the sound of bickering and combat. To avoid us, the pair had had to trespass on the territory of another couple, and the male would spar with male, and even the demure hen would square up to another of her own sex. Very little harm would be done. Probably it was one way of working off the spring ardour. Ned, the old postman, found me gazing intently into a pond that nestled in a clump of trees. "Those aren't fish moving about in the water, are they?" I asked, pointing to the centre of the pond, where the surface was continually being ruffled, as though a small shoal of mackerel were darting about. Ned shook his head. "It's the trysting place of the frogs," he said simply. I looked at him and waited for his explanation. "All through winter," he continued, "them frogs has been hibernating. Have you ever found any?" I shook my head. "Sometimes," said Ned, "they lie in holes singly. Sometimes a whole heap of 'em'll flatten themselves together as though they were huddling up for warmth. Mind you can't feel their warmth. They're about as warm in your hands as cold mutton. But inside 'em are stores of fat, and when they come out of their winter sleep ready for spawning, that's a miracle almost in itself." He looked at me to see if I understood what he was saying. "You mean," I said, "that they ought to be too thin and exhausted after their winter sleep to think of laying eggs, and so using up what strength they had left?" "That's it now," said Ned appreciatively, in a tone which a schoolmaster would use to some scholar who was making satisfactory progress. "Well," he went on, "as soon as they wake up, they set out for some pond or ditch. They know where it is, and make a beeline for it. Some ponds they won't have at no price. They pass by 'em. This pond here doesn't have a very inviting look to you and me, but ever since I were a boy you could allus find 'em full of 'em, and I reckon they've been coming to it perhaps for hundreds and hundreds of years." Not far from the village we met Sally Stordy, with a large basket on her arm, the contents covered with a spotless linen cloth. Raq sniffed at it with approval, and I heard Sally say, "You'd like some of that butter in there, I reckon, wouldn't you, old fella?" Ned went off on his rounds when he saw me taking the heavy weight from Sally. Then I asked her where she was going. "I'm just off to market," she said. "Whiterig's missus isn't up at mark, so I'm taking her butter and eggs to Penrith for her." "I'll go with you, Sally," I said, suddenly changing my plans. "Are you making for the station?" She shook her head. "My car and shovel are at bottom of the hill," she said, smiling, and then I remembered that the bus ran past the crossroads. As I waited for it, a number of cars flashed by, all packed with baskets similar to the one set down at my side. Sally seemed to know all the drivers. "It used to be Carrier's cart for that lot," said Sally, nodding in the direction taken by the cars. "Only a few years since. The driver at the last one was Tom Hutchinson. He never thought he'd run his own car when he were a lad. His father started like our Tom, with only a few shillin' a week and 8 children, and his father afore him went out. But he's gone on, I reckon. He's a hard 'un but a worker, mind you." Then an old-fashioned gig ambled by. How quaint they looked, perched up in back-to-back seats. Sticking up by the side of the baskets which were stowed in the back, I caught a glimpse of one of those large umbrellas under which the occupants used to hide in bad weather. "There's no need for Tom Graham to drive that old mare," said Sally after it had passed. "It's gone to market every week for 20 years and could go there blindfold. He's near and is Tom. That's his old missus sitting by him. She wore that black bonnet with a yellow flower in it for our 15 years to my knowledge, and when she goes to a funeral she takes flowers off and... Then the bus, crowded with farmers and their wives, dealers, buyers, came snorting along, and picking up the dog in my arms, we managed to stow ourselves among the multitudinous baskets which occupied every available inch of space. I left Sally at the Royal George, where the bus stopped, telling her that I should probably find her in the market later on. The little town of Penworth was alive. For 6 days in the week it lies in a comatose condition, but on market day it really wakes up. I walked to the centre, where stands the cross, and around which is a good-sized square. Here are displayed ploughs, separators, troughs, spades, fertilisers, and 100 other things which a farm demands. Round about these I could see scores of men, and as I wanted to find Alan and Joe, my farmer friends, I walked amongst them. As I passed one little group, I felt my arm pulled, and the next moment I was in a circle of men, amongst whom were my 2 friends. None of them resented my presence, some of them nodded gravely at me. First of all I found myself listening to a language that was entirely foreign. Men were talking about grey-faced lambing hogs, weather hogs, shearlings, brood mares. I looked hopelessly at Alan, and he whispered that he would explain later, so I took the opportunity of observing our neighbours. All were gathered in groups similar to my own. Each group was in a constant state of flux. Men were continually sidling into it. Others were continually abstracting themselves and moving on to a fresh circle. Neither handshakes nor introductions were indulged in. How delightfully different from the formal conventionalities of town. Sometimes the group discussed prices, then a bit of gossip would be related, then a name would be mentioned, and sometimes men shook their heads as they heard it, or looked away up the street as they spoke it. The group understood these signs, and knew just what such mannerisms were meant to convey. I think that it would take each man 3 or 4 hours to revolve all the way round the square, but in those 3 hours how much knowledge could be absorbed, and the things learnt would then be carried to remote hamlets and to still more remote farmsteads. "Not many best hogs about," said a farmer to me, and I saw Joe look at me wondering what I should answer. "Not many," I replied, trying to look as though I understood what he was talking about. "Sturks are fetching about £15," he continued, giving me a quizzical look. "A very useful price," I said knowingly, and I could see Alan and Joe nudging one another and almost bursting with laughter at my non-committal answer. "That's the word to use when you're in doubt," said Alan to me later. "There's now like words such as fairish, goodish and useful. If you'd have said splendid, he'd have knowed you were a townsman." I wandered into the market. Before me ran long rows of tables, scrubbed white. Each table had a number on it. Here, with their baskets full of farm produce, stood the farmers' wives. Customers moved up and down those long rows, examining chickens, feeling rabbits, scrutinising eggs, and asking questions. I found Sally standing by her wares, and a little later she left me to speak to a friend. Just at that moment a hard-featured woman came up. Only for a fleeting second did she glance at me. Then down went her head towards the eggs in Sally's basket, as though she were judging them by the smell. "What are the eggs?" she rapped out like a drill sergeant. I was rather taken aback by this onslaught. I have in my short lifetime been taken for many things, poacher, parson, solicitor and commercial traveller, but I have never yet been mistaken for a purveyor of farmyard commodities. I looked too simple for that. However, I rose to the occasion, and after swallowing hard I replied professionally, "These," pointing to the brown ones, "are laid by Rhode Island Reds, while these," here I put my finger on the white ones, "are produced by Whiteleg." "Nah," my customer broke in scornfully. "How much are ye asking?" "1 and 5 a dozen," I promptly replied. "You'll have to come down a bit, I reckon," she replied as she walked away. Later I saw her examining other baskets, and I followed my almost customer at a respectful distance. Right down the long lane of selling humanity she cruised. How many times she stopped behind a basket and smelled the eggs, how many times she stopped and asked the same question she had asked me, I cannot say, After the 10th time I lost sight of her. Probably, somewhere or other, she finally found some anxious vendor and got a dozen eggs for 1 and 4. In talking to her neighbours, she will probably gloat over the fact that she had bought eggs at a penny cheaper than they had done. That will be her moment of triumph. She will be known as a keen buyer. But if she had sat down quietly and reckoned up carefully, she would have found that in saving a penny on eggs, she had probably worn out 3 pennyworth of shoe leather. That is the worst of having an economical mind. I told Sally of my experience and she laughed heartily. That calls to my mind something that happened once, she said. A woman came round and looked at my basket, which was full of eggs. I want a dozen eggs, she said, that had been laid by black hens. Well, I didn't know which had been laid by black or which had been laid by white hens, but I told her to pick her own if she knew the difference between 'em. Can you tell the difference? Sally asked me. I shook my head. I don't believe anyone can, I said. Well, said Sally with a grim smile, she could. She turned over the eggs and began putting 'em in her basket, and when she got a dozen she said, "Them are our 8. As she paid me for 'em, I said to her, looking at the eggs, "It seems to me that black hens lay all the biggest eggs." "Aye," she said as she turned away. "That's how you tell 'em." I too made a purchase, for by the side of one basket lay a tiny bunch of primroses. How my heart rejoiced when I saw them. They had been gathered from some quiet nook where the keen wind could not penetrate. From their snug retreat they had caught every ray of the sun, and now smiled them back at me. I bought them and felt sorry for them. Although I delighted in them, yet I would 10,000 times rather have found them myself, and so having enjoyed their simple beauty in their natural setting. They now rest in a tiny vase on my mantelpiece. Outside a cold wind is blowing, and dark clouds are gathering, but these little flowers are the earnest of our inheritance.